China is definitely not an ally of Russia. I mean, this Friends Without Limits, that was BS. Um, but I think China, what they care about the most is maintaining status quo, maintaining access to cheap Russian oil and gas.
Putin wanted to intimidate Poland. That's why he sent 1,000 Russian troops to Belarus to take part in an exercise practicing an invasion of the Polish nation. But now it seems Putin's intimidation tactics are backfiring horrendously. Poland put down its own 40,000 troops along the Belarusian border, and on top of that, they shut down the border crossings that connected China, Russia, and Belarus to Europe. Now, Belarus is freaking out, China is freaking out, and of course, Russia is feeling the pinch. So today, let's go over exactly what Russia was trying to do, why it backfired, and why China is extremely pissed off because of this.
Barbed wire rolled out as Poland closes 2 of the remaining border crossings with Belarus. Warsaw says it's closing the border until further notice, saying Russian and Belarusian military drills are to blame.
Zamknęliśmy ruch na granicy polsko-białoruskiej.
We closed traffic on the Polish-Belarusian border. This is due to the Zapad maneuvers. These maneuvers are aimed squarely at Poland and the European Union. These maneuvers are practicing aggressive warfare scenarios against our country.
So it all started with this Russian-Belarusian military exercise that took place right at the Polish border. It was called Zapad 2025, which literally translates to West 2025. Now, the last time this exercise actually happened was back in 2021, when Russia used the exercise as an excuse to gather 200,000 Russian military personnel right at the Ukrainian border. Now, with benefit of hindsight, we know Russia also used the exercise as a stress test for the full-scale Ukrainian invasion that came just a few months after the 2021 exercise. But just to contrast that 2021 exercise with the one Russia is doing right now, we can see that the Russian military is suffering tremendously. Because last time they had 200,000 Russian military personnel taking part, while this time they had few thousands, and some estimates actually say as low as just 1,000 Russian troops were there alongside 7,000 Belarusian troops. It just goes to show you the manpower shortages that Russia is facing after its invasion of Ukraine. Now, even with such a small force, Poland was not happy with Russia carrying out this exercise right at its border. So they announced a week in advance of the exercise that Poland will be closing all the border crossings until the exercise is over. That was the initial plan. The exercise was scheduled for September 12th to September 16th, and Poland closed its borders on September 9th. This was all public knowledge even before the exercise took place. But what made the situation worse was the Russian drone attack against Polish citizens. You see, on September 10th, just one day after Poland closed its borders, and 2 days before this Zapad exercise was supposed to begin, 19 Russian drones breached Polish airspace in an unprecedented overnight attack on NATO. This was first time NATO jets were used to take down Russian drones to protect Polish citizens. In response, Poland activated NATO's Article 4. This allows member states to request consultations when they believe their security is under threat. Now, all the while this was happening, panic was spreading all across the Belarusian border. Over 1,500 vehicles were stuck trying to cross into Poland when borders were closed off. And after the Russian drone attack, Polish authorities actually said the border crossings will be closed indefinitely, and they would only reopen once authorities were 100% certain that there was no threat coming from the east. Now, this is where things get interesting, because China is actually really dependent on this border crossing that connects China, Russia, Belarus to Europe. But before we get to how China is involved, let's quickly go over how Russia is responding to Poland's actions. Let's listen from Russian spokesperson Dmitry Medvedev.
Well, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has described European concerns about these drills as emotional overload. Some might see that brushing aside of those concerns as an indication that they are in fact valid.
Well, Peskov repeatedly said that the drills were not aimed at any particular country and then other countries have nothing to worry. However, Europe, and especially here Baltic states, have every right to be concerned. Because in past, Russia often used military drills as a preparation for real military aggression, like full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 followed the exercises in 2021. So NATO's eastern flank members, Poland, Lithuania and Latvia, are on high alert these days, especially after the drone incident. Following this, Poland actually closed its border with Belarus. Poland, Latvia and Lithuania also closed part of their airspace. And all these countries are conducting military drills these days as well, with special attention to Suwałki Corridor. It's a stretch of land that connects Baltic states to the rest of Europe, and it's said to be one of the most vulnerable parts of NATO's eastern flank.
Now let's talk about China. I'm sure you guys remember BRI, China's Belt and Road Initiative. Well, guess what? Belarus is actually one of the more important hubs in Xi Jinping's plan to take over the world. Rail traffic passes through Belarus that connects Chinese factories to consumers in Europe, and the same traffic from Belarus passes into Poland. In fact, 90% of all rail goods that move from China to Europe actually go through this railway line. Now, unfortunately for China, the Russian intimidation tactics are backfiring and hurting the Chinese economy. Because since Poland has shut down its borders, the Chinese goods are stuck in Belarus, where people don't really have the money to afford even the cheap Chinese goods. I guess that's what happens when you're living under a dictatorship. Now, this is not some small issue for China because according to last year's data that was made public, roughly $29 billion of trade happened through this border crossing that Poland has now closed indefinitely. That's why we saw Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi quickly go to Poland to figure out some way to reopen it as soon as possible.
Polish officials admitted the disruption would cause losses, but argued that security came first. For Beijing, the timing was particularly difficult. The China-Europe Railway Express is the flagship project linking Chinese factories to European consumers. It is faster than shipping by sea and cheaper than sending goods by air. China sees Poland as a crucial partner in this system. So, when Warsaw closed its border, Beijing made its displeasure clear. Chinese diplomats argue that the trains benefit both sides. Europe receives fast, affordable goods, while Chinese exporters gain access to one of the world's largest markets. Polish leaders see it differently. They argue that borders are part of national defense.
Now, let's talk about what Poland means when it says China needs to rein Moscow in, because it does not have to do with the Ukraine invasion that's currently going on. No, in fact, this is about the hybrid war that Russia and Belarus have been carrying out against Poland since 2021. You see, back then, Belarusian dictator Lukashenko faced heavy US sanctions for cracking down on protesters and forcing down a Ryanair flight to arrest a dissident journalist. Belarus was not happy about the sanctions, so in retaliation, they opened a new front in the war: migration. Here's how it works. Belarus began luring in migrants from Middle East and Africa with promises of an easy getaway into European Union. State-linked travel agencies advertised tourist packages to Minsk, complete with visa, flights, and even hotel stays. Once migrants arrived, Belarusian border guards escorted them to the edge of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, often cutting through fences, supplying water cutters, and pushing these groups directly towards EU territory. Poland accused Belarus of using these people as weapons, human battering ram in a political game. The sudden influx of migrants put a huge pressure on Polish border towns, overwhelmed security forces, and sparked humanitarian cries in the forest where migrants were trapped between Belarusian and Polish scars. Some even froze to death in winter. But Lukashenko's goal was not compassion, it was coercion. By artificially creating chaos in EU's border, Belarus hoped to destabilize Poland and force the EU to lift sanctions and retaliate for Western support of Belarusian opposition. Many analysts believe Russia quietly backed this strategy since any friction inside NATO benefits Moscow. The standoff also fueled political debates inside Poland between those demanding a hard line against Lukashenko's weaponized migration and those alarmed at human cost. Well, now Poland is using a similar strategy to get Belarus and Russia to stop. Poland has cut down China's lifeline to Europe, and it wants Xi Jinping to use his influence over Moscow to stop this covert war. But the thing is, Poland did try something like this last year and it was not successful. As in, it wasn't successful for long term. It did help for a few months according to Polish foreign minister, but soon China took off its pressure from Belarus and Russia and these countries just went back to their old ways. Well, this time, the hybrid operations have intensified, so Polish authorities have more political will to make sure China does something that produces a long-term solution. Now, this is not the only border issue that Russia is facing. In fact, EU is now discussing a visa ban on all Russians who are still visiting European countries, all the while their government is carrying out an invasion of a sovereign nation. Now, this is what I wanted to talk about with a journalist based out of Ukraine, Colin Robertson. He has been very critical of EU basically allowing Russians to continue life as usual, all the while Ukrainians are getting killed by the Russian invasion. So I had him on the podcast, but before we get into that discussion, I want to show you guys what he has been arguing because this has caused quite a bit of uproar in the Russian community that's outside of Russia.
I don't think the majority of Russians, everyday Russians, care. They didn't care in 2014 and they knew what was happening. They didn't care in 2022. The only Russian refugees that fled the country were Amazon refugees, is what I call them. These are people who didn't care what they did in Georgia, Syria, the Middle East, and Crimea and Ukraine. But as soon as sanctions started coming in and they couldn't order McDonald's to their house, they couldn't get their Amazon packages, then it's a step too far. Then they decided to flee Russia because they don't care, because the Soviet mindset has existed and still exists for a very, very long time. It didn't collapse in 1991, it just changed. And the Soviet mindset is to be indifferent to human life and to have a fundamental overarching belief, a very racist belief actually, that the motherland of Russia and the genetics of being Russia is all that matters and everybody else are just states to be colonized. And that is a universal belief that Russians believe all across society, from the lower to the upper class. So if suddenly propaganda was put out, counter-Russian propaganda, and Russians realized what was actually going on, they would be indifferent. When I was in Kursk, when I spoke to Russians in Russian territory and asked them what they thought about what was happening in Ukraine, a lot of them were pretty much indifferent. They were actually complaining themselves that things were a bit disrupted, the mobile networks were down, and they were most annoyed that they couldn't contact other relatives, what they had been, not what their country had been doing to Ukraine. So it's an indifference, and that will never change. Russia and Russians are not going to be convinced otherwise. Navalny was meant to be the alternative to Putin. He was meant to be the Great Awakening, you know, this amazing, beautiful turning point for Russia. Navalny supported, now he's dead, the invasion of Ukraine. He was indifferent to the invasion of Crimea because even the Russian opposition still has that mindset, still has a Soviet mindset of the motherland of Russia and colonialism. And that's not going to stop at the end of Putin, and it's not going to stop when people in Russia know what's going on. It's only going to stop when Russia is destroyed economically and they can't afford this war anymore. They physically can't afford to buy the weapons or buy the North Korean soldiers. That's it. That's the only way to do it. And we can do that with sanctions, and we can stop buying our filthy gas, but they literally have to be put into a position where they can't afford the war. They cannot be convinced to protest otherwise. And that's like the really harsh realization since I've been living here that I really realized. Having seen Russia for what it is close up, I think that it's just a basket case at this point.
YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one right here. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that everyone should start a channel. But if you have ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel or a faceless channel, now is a perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions of dollars every single day, and it's pushing newer and smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure you have many questions on how to start and grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. That's why we decided to put all our YouTube advice into one YouTube video for completely free. So if you're someone interested in starting your own channel, you can watch that video here on YouTube by clicking the link in the description or card on your screen. Since we're talking about how Russians should feel, and of course I agree that they should feel something about Russia just trying to take over a sovereign country, killing innocent civilians. One of your content piece recently went viral. I know on Instagram, I'm not sure if that's on TikTok too, and a lot of Russians are, I guess, angry about it, and we'll play it right here so audience gets the sense. You basically argue that a lot of Russians who have left Russia don't really care about what their country is doing. They just don't want it affecting them, and that's why they left. They're not like against the war, maybe small percentages. I didn't see the whole podcast, just the clip. Are you arguing they shouldn't get visas? Because that's something I think EU is discussing right now, and many Russian opposition figures have spoken out against it.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the high-profile Russians that have left with big YouTube channels that are supposedly anti-war, most of the content that they put out are being disgruntled. They're annoyed that they can't make certain deliveries anymore. They're annoyed that they might get drafted. It's about a personal grievance. It's not really about what their country is doing. You know, Roman, who made a video about me, a very big YouTuber with 1 million subscribers, didn't make a video about Bucha, didn't make a video about what his country was doing when that was coming out in the news, but did make a video complaining about the EU clamping down on Russian security, Russian visas. And I am actually of the opinion that no Russian right now should be allowed to enter the EU, not one. Not as a refugee and not as a tourist, because right now, Russia as a state has declared war not just on Ukraine, but basically on the rest of Europe. If you watch Russia Today and all of these programs, they say that they're at war with NATO, and the risk of espionage and spies is through the roof. And the money that most of the rich Russians get is associated with the government. The government of Russia is an economically, it's a country at war. That spends most of its money on that war, and it's usually soldiers or high-ranking officials that are going to the mountains of France and spending that money, that Kremlin money, that they've been given to kill Ukrainians on luxury champagne and luxury resorts. I don't think that Europe should normalize and tolerate that sort of thing. So I think right now, while this is happening, there should be no Russians allowed in Europe, and that might make me seem unsympathetic. But if you want to make a complaint about that, I suggest complaining to the Russian government or being annoyed at what Russia is doing. And that's it. We issued, there has been a 30% increase in tourist visas accepted into the Schengen zone, 580,000 this year, up 30% from last year. And I think it puts Europe at risk, and it normalizes relationships with a country that is not behaving like a civilized nation. And so I'm very much against that, and I still have that opinion. If you are Russian and you don't like it, then I'm afraid that's what happens when your country behaves like a colonialist, imperialist country. Look at the way that left-wingers talk about the colonialist, evil past of Great Britain in the 1700s, what they did to India, what they did all across the world, and that generations down through British society, we should still feel some sort of collective guilt in Britain. British people should, over that. Well, Russia is doing that today, but apparently Russians should feel absolutely no collective guilt, despite actually being from and paying tax to that country. So I have no time for it. And I think the reason Russians are so angry about me talking about this is because it's striking a chord. It struck a chord with them. They know that they left because life became difficult. And the last point I'll make on it is, if I was to speak to a Russian right now who left because they disagreed with the war in 2022, I would say, why didn't you leave in 2014 when your country stole Crimea? Why didn't you leave in 2014 when they did what they did in the Donbass? Why didn't you leave before that when they did what they did in Georgia? It's only when sanctions kicked in and life became more difficult did you decide to get on a plane and leave Russia. So that's what I would ask you if you're a Russian right now. Why now? Why now when your country's been doing this for a long time? And I will not back down from that.
No, that makes sense. I understand the argument you're making. This is where I want to bring up an argument actually I just heard from Gary Kasparov. He's very knowledgeable about Russian history, the Russian politics and everything. And one argument he makes, and this is how we can end the war, is basically explaining that we want to brain drain Russia. We want all these smart people who are helping the regime, who are basically, helping this war go on. We want them to leave Russia and go to different countries. And the way we can do that is, instead of giving out visitor visas, which I think he's against too, we should just give out refugee visas where they have to denounce the war. That way, that's illegal in Russia, so they cannot go back, and then they can come to a different country. Because to me, that makes sense. Because again, I don't know about you, I don't think the Western countries are putting boots on the ground, because it just doesn't seem like, based on everything we have seen, right? So it's unlikely that Ukraine will be able to push back Russia. I want that to happen, just realistically speaking. I don't know how likely that is. So one way we can just kill that Russian imperial mindset is by just Russia collapsing, similar to like Soviet Union. I wonder what you think about that argument. And I know you probably didn't have a lot of time to think about it because I just told you this, but whatever your reaction is.
I think smart and the upper class, the upper echelons of Russia have been very easily able to leave at any point since 2022. It's not about whether they can get refugees visas or not. They can and have already been able to do that. They can get flights basically to Turkey and then to Europe, and they can do whatever they want. This is what a huge amount of. I don't really think it makes much of a difference. I mean, I don't really think there's much of an argument. We're probably talking about a tiny number of people. Again, Europe is at risk of espionage and spies from Russia. And we should have a zero tolerance for it right now. And the brain drain, I mean, most of the smart Russians from Poland have left anyway. They've left the country. It's already experiencing a labor famine right now. Or they're actively involved in the war campaign and they're involved in the government. So I don't really know who and where these people are. But I think there's such an insignificant number, it doesn't matter. Again, this doesn't mean all Russians. Bill Browder is one of my absolute icons. This is a man that helped set up companies with Putin back in the 90s, realized how much of a mafia state it was, became a refugee in Britain, and has spent his career talking about Russia, about what Russia really is, about why they're committing these crimes. He's written amazing books on it, and he's now on, Vladimir Putin's list as well, because he has exposed the inner workings of Russia. He's a hero for doing that. He's incredible for doing that, and he's Russian, right? So I don't hate all Russians, but he actively dismantled, using the information he has, what he saw inside that system, and for that I congratulate him. I just haven't seen that from many other Russians. Again, people who have been doing hit pieces on me recently, Russians who are quite big on YouTube, don't do that. They don't talk about war crimes that Putin is doing. They don't talk about the imperialist mindset that led to that happening. They do expose videos on pro-Ukraine journalists, which is a bit weird.